Greetings, everyone. Today we're going to talk about research ethics. So when we're considering ethics and behavioral research, we have a couple of terms that we should use, that we should understand. And I'm going to go ahead and just read these word by word so you can read along with me. So the term ethics describes appropriate human action in areas such as business, medicine, health, religion, and research. Research ethics is used to identify the actions that a researcher must take to conduct responsible and moral research. Engaging in responsible research requires a researcher to anticipate what might happen, react to what is happening, and reflect on what did happen. So looking at the history of ethics and research, one of the things that triggered the consideration of ethics was World War II and some of the Nazi medical experiments in the concentration camps, or what they claimed was research. So they did a lot of things that were extraordinarily inhumane, such as immersing living people in icy waters, placing them in compression chambers, starving them to death, cutting them with slivers of glass. They did a lot of very torturous things and claimed they were research. From 1945 to 1947, some of the individuals and the physicians that were responsible were tried in the international courts, and this came to be known as the Nuremberg trials. On August of 1947, the trial included a section called Permissible Medical Experiments, which came to be known as the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code has 10 key elements, and I'm not going to go through them word for word. You feel free to pause and you can do this on your own. But the gist of the Nuremberg Code are things that we still follow today. The participant needs to be voluntary. We're trying to avoid unnecessary physical or mental suffering or injury, trying to have least risk. Experiments should not be conducted if we think that death or disabling injury can occur. The experiment should be conducted by scientifically qualified persons, etc. So you can see some of these rules that came out of the Nuremberg trials that we see in the Nuremberg Code were very crucial, and we still follow them today. But after the Nuremberg Code, the next thing that we saw that was a big set of rules was the Belmont Report, and this is for the field of psychology, and it provides the set of ethical guidelines that researchers in psychology need to stick to. It lists the responsibilities of the researchers during research and the rights of the human participants. Some of the things that we see from the Belmont Report are: you have to have respect for persons, there must be beneficence, and justice. So respect for persons is that individuals have capacity to participate, they have the ability to comprehend their role in research, and they are free of coercion. So basically this is voluntary and they understand that they're doing research. Beneficence is that research need to make every effort they can to minimize risk and maximize the benefits. So we're doing research that does the least amount of harm to humans, and it's important research, and it will benefit society as a whole to gain this knowledge. Justice is having equality and fairness in the treatment of human participants in scientific research. 3 very important and great things to live by as a researcher. Some of the previous studies that we've learned from, the Stanley Milgram study, I think a lot of you might know about that, and I'll discuss this in a little bit in a couple of slides. But this was out of Yale in 1961, and they were looking to see the willingness of a participant to obey authority. The participant was asked to shock another participant and knew that the other participant had a heart condition. The subjects believed they were actually shocking the other person, and the participants exhibited a lot of stress, but they still continued to shock the other participants. They didn't want to, but they definitely responded to the authoritarian telling them to continue to do this. There ended up being some backlash from this trial, and people were definitely, after the study was over, people had some lingering effects of guilt and nightmares and things like this when they realized that what had happened, it was something that the participants were harmed in a way that wasn't anticipated. So we definitely learned a lot from this. Another trial that was very interesting was the Tuskegee syphilis study, and this was from 1932 to 1972, done by the U.S. Public Health Service. And they were studying untreated men. They were studying men that had syphilis that were untreated. So they knowingly did not treat men with syphilis. They told the men that they were helping them and giving them free medical care for bad blood. Unfortunately, they were not really helping them. They were just observing them. And there were, by the time the proper medication came around, they chose not to give it to the men, and the men suffered and unnecessarily. So they were never actually treated. And this was something that sparked the research community, and ethically, this was something that should not have continued the way it did. Here are some of the dates and specifics of the Tuskegee syphilis study that you can pause and read through this. I'm not going to go through it each line, but it's pretty interesting. And it actually, like I said, it started in 1932 and it went to 1972. And it wasn't until 1997 when President Bill Clinton apologized formally on behalf of the nation for what we had done to several men that should not have happened. A couple of other experiments that you may have heard about is the Stanford prison study, and this is the one that was done by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, and he had 24 participants, and he assigned some of them to be guards and some of them to be inmates, and it was stopped after 6 days because the personalities and the behaviors that the participants took on became so aggressive so quickly. They hadn't foreseen that, and they actually had to stop the study. And then Laud Humphrey's tea room trade study, and this is the one, for whatever reason, this one resonated with me the most. When I think of ethics, I think of Laud Humphrey's tea room trade study, and this was where he was a participant in anonymous male sexual encounters in public restrooms, also known as tea rooms. And he was either the lookout or he was a voyeur or observer. And he did not get consent from the participants because it was a public place, so consent wasn't necessarily needed. However, he decided to go out and get license plates of several of the cars of some of the men that were engaging in these sexual acts. He then went to their home and interviewed them, and over 58% of the men that were his participants were actually married and identified as straight, although they were engaging in homosexual acts. He was, during the interviews, kept the actions of the men. He withheld that from the wives. The wives did not know why he was actually there. He was there under the premise of getting health records on the men. But eventually he published his story very publicly, and in doing so, the women who were interviewed by him realized that their husbands were the ones that were engaging in the sexual acts, the homosexual acts in the bathroom, and therefore he outed many straight men. So he had stuck to a lot of the proper standards of research, but inadvertently outed people, which caused a lot of harm. This was the one that kind of made me think about one of the benefits that we currently have now with an IRB, or an internal review board, which we're going to discuss. But it's to help with these unexpected and unanticipated things that could happen. As I said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Milgram obedience experiment. So Stanley Milgram wanted to know how much people were willing to listen to authority. So they had set it up to where they had one person who was assigned to be the teacher, and this was the actual participant of the study that did not know the study and did not know the real reason for the study. And then the other person was paid to act as a participant, as the learner. And this was someone that knew what was going on. He was also known as the confidant, or the confidant. The learner, or the actor, was supposedly supposed to memorize words. This is what the teacher thought, the participant thought. In reality, the learner was just on the other side of the wall acting. He was not actually memorizing or learning or failing to learn words, and he was never shocked. But the teacher was told that for every incorrect response, they were going to shock the person on the other wall, behind the wall, to help teach them. And what he was really studying was to see how far someone was willing to go. So they were supposed to raise the increments of volts every 15 volts. No shocks were actually admitted or ever administered to the person behind the wall. However, as they kept increasing the volts, the person on the other side of the wall would yell and, ouch, I have a heart condition, and oh my gosh, stop it. And sometimes they would go silent, except the teacher or the participant would look to the authoritarian figure and say, I don't think I should do this. And the man in the doctor's white coat would say, nope, you need to keep going. And then they would still do it. So they clearly didn't want to, but they did anyway. They felt very like they were supposed to. Over 100% of the participants shocked the learner up to 300 volts, and 65% of the participants shocked the learner to the maximum 450 volts, which would be enough to kill a human being. And remember, these were raised in 15-volt increments, so this went on for a long period of time where it was just rising up and up and up and up. One of the key ethical concerns was that even though most of the participants did follow the orders, they were very clearly upset. They pleaded to stop the experiment. There are many videos of this, and there's men who think the other person has died. They're very visibly upset. Then after this happened, they were told the true intent of the experiment and that no shocks were given. They shook hands with the guy on the other side of the wall. But what really happened is a lot of these men went home and they felt horribly guilty that they were willing to go that far. They felt duped by the experiment itself, and many of the men had a lot of post-traumatic experiences. So ultimately, I think the design initially had some value to it, but this unexpected post-reaction that happened did do a lot of harm to the participants. The Stanford prison study, when we break that down, half of the people became guards, half of the people became prisoners, and within 6 days it became very clear that the guards were very aggressive. The prisoners increased psychological and physical harm as the guards' actions progressed. And these were young, happy college students that were not prison guards. So this was not what they had anticipated seeing. It got very accelerated very fast. So there was concern for the welfare of the participants and especially for the prisoners, and this needed to stop abruptly. A lot of these cases, starting with the World War II, I almost said Zimbardo, and that's not correct. That's the Stanford prison experiment, the Nuremberg trials, plus some of these bigger cases, is sort of what happened to start things such as the human participation in research with IRBs and the APA Code of Conduct. So IRBs stand for Internal Review Boards, and it became mandatory that anyone doing research with federal money whatsoever must have I keep saying internal, institutional review board. If you are at a university that gets federal money, if you're using a federal grant, if you're at a federal agency, if there's federal money involved, you have to have an institutional review board. The institutional review board, well, actually, I'll wait a minute because that's going to be my next slide. In addition to that, APA, or the American Psychological Association, adopted a method of assessing risk known as the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. So they have their own that they added in 2010, the APA Code of Conduct, known as the APA Code of Conduct. And it sort of plays off of and extends the ethical principles of the Belmont Report to include, it adds the fidelity and responsibility and integrity. An institutional review board, or IRB, is a review board that has at least 5 members, and always there will be at least one from an outside institution. The members on the review board are going to receive a proposal for research and review it and determine if there are any problems, gaps, concerns about the research. They will then either approve or suggest changes to the research prior to the research being done. And again, any institution that receives federal funding must have an IRB, or an institutional review board. The protocol for this is that a researcher is going to create a proposal of what they want to do. They're going to outline in extreme detail what they intend to do so that they can minimize risk to the participants, so that they have, it speaks about how you protect identity, data, anonymity. There's concern for health risk, mental health risk, all of these things, everything you plan to do, not only to perform the experiment, but all of the measures and steps you're going to take to do the experiment in a manner that is the least harm and highest benefit for the participants and the research overall. You cannot do research unless it is approved by IRB. Now, the interesting thing is, if something is approved by IRB, and oftentimes we get out in the field, we're doing research, sometimes research can take a year or 2 years, and something might happen and you need to change your research, you need to go back to IRB and get approval. I'm instantly thinking of what's happening right now with COVID. A lot of people maybe had a plan in place. Maybe they're going to go to tattoo parlors to study behaviors, but when tattoo parlors then weren't open, maybe they decided they're going to start interviewing tattoo artists that are now out of work or something. I'm just making that up, but there are times we need to, once we start our research, we need to change what we thought we would do due to whatever reasons. And that does happen, and that is okay, but you must go to the IRB and let them know what's happening, what the change is, and get approval for the change. So when institutional approval is required, you have to do a few things. You need to always give very detailed, very accurate information concerning the proposal that you're putting forth, the program of research that you want to do, exactly what you want to do, how and why. You then obtain the approval from IRB before conducting the research. Then you conduct the research in accordance with what IRB approved. Again, if you need to change it, you need to go back to IRB and make the addendum or the amendment and change it and get the approval for the change. So first you get your IRB approval. The next things that we need to do, this is very important as far as sticking with our code of conduct, are the steps that need to be submitted for an IRB approval. These are the things that you're going to detail ahead of time as to how you're going to do this. But in all research, you need to get informed consent. Then you conduct your research, but you need to know how you're going to do it. And you also need to know how you're going to debrief. The informed consent, the conducting procedures, and the debriefing, this all will be in the IRB for approval, this will be part of your proposal of how you're going to do all of this. An informed consent is a signed or verbal, always better to get signed, agreement in which the participants say that they are willing to do this, that they're volunteering, they know that they can leave at any time, but they are giving permission to be a part of this study. They know they're participating in research. An assent is the consent of a minor or a legally incapable person to agree to participate in research. And this is very important if you're getting an assent from a minor or from somebody who might have a different level of understanding. You need to be very, very clear, and you need to explain in the assent in a language that is understandable to the participant. There are a few things that you always want to put in a letter of consent or an assent for the participants. So if you are not doing deceptive research, then you want to put the purpose of the research. We don't always do that. Sometimes we leave that out for a reason. But if you can put it in, then you put it in. You want to also inform the participant how long you think it's going to take and what procedures will be used. Even if you're giving a survey, is it 15 minutes or is it an hour? You want to let people know. You want to communicate this. You want to let the participant know they can leave at any time. There are no consequences for withdrawing or declining. They need to be very, very clear that they are not forced to stay. This came again directly from the Stanley Milgram experiment, where the participants wanted to end and felt that they couldn't. We need to be very, very, very thorough and let the participants know that they are agreeing to volunteer. They are voluntarily doing this, and that they can leave at any time, and there is no consequence of leaving or withdrawing. If there is a consequence, such as if you're in a medical trial and maybe there's a medication, they might not still get the medication or something possibly to that effect. And if that's the case, that needs to be written in there. If there's any potential risk of participation, you need to let people know that. If there's any limits of confidentiality, if it's something that people might be identified, they need to be aware of that. If there are any incentives for the participation, you need to let them know that as well. And always you want to let the participants know how they can get a hold of a contact in regard to the research that they've been a part of, if they have any questions regarding the research or any of their rights. So oftentimes, even in a survey, on the opening screen for the consent, and it will say, here's the email address if you have any future questions. Some other guidelines that you might want to consider when you're preparing an informed consent are that you want to avoid language that is blaming. It wants to be free of blame, so avoid the exculpatory language. You want to use specific or numeric values versus very subjective things like rare. So instead of saying there's a rare risk, you want to say there's less than a 5% or less than a 2% chance of something. If participants are needing a translator, one needs to be provided to them. And you want to keep the technical jargon out. You don't want to speak to the participants in the language that you know, because you have a strong background in this field. You want to be able to speak to them so that they can understand what they're signing, what they're agreeing to, and that they can leave at any time. And if you're doing research on something that you want to share with them, you need to share it with them in a way that they will understand it from someone who's not studying the same thing. And be clear, use a nice large font throughout the form so that everyone can read it. If you're going to be recording voices, you need to also get consent for this. You need to obtain informed consent. Now, there are two exceptions to this. If research is being conducted in a strictly naturalistic setting, and there's no anticipated risk of personal identification harm. If you're sitting at the, maybe you're observing people at the beach, a nice big public place, and you're just kind of interested in types of conversations. There's nothing about the type of people. You just want to know how many people are talking about football versus how many people are talking about other stuff. I don't know, something like this. That would not require an informed consent. The other time that and I mentioned it earlier, that we may not get informed consent prior to the research is if there is deception and consent is then obtained and needed, but it's done afterwards. And in a silly way, this reminds me of the TV show with the four men, impractical jokers, how they play pranks on each other or participants, and then after the prank they go and get the consent, but you can't get it before or the people would know. So there are times when we're doing research and we need to be deceptive. If the participants were aware of what we were doing, they wouldn't respond the same way. We wouldn't get the same natural response or natural behavior. So we do things which is called deceptive research. And again, this would go through IRB. IRB is aware of it. There would be, you have to let people know. And as soon as you can, you want to let people know that they were a part of this. You want to debrief them and get their consent as soon as you can, at the soonest possible moment. When you have what's known as subordinate research participants, which might be a client or a student or a patient, or even, I also think of sometimes the vulnerable populations, such as people that are in prison or jail. You always want to be very aware that you have to be very clear to them that they will not be penalized for withdrawing at any time. If you have promised, as an example, if you've promised college students extra credit points for participating in the research and they show up to the research and they get a quarter of the way through and they go, I don't like this, I want out, you still give them the extra credit points. You can't penalize them for not completing the research. There are very few times that we're going to dispense with the informed consent for research. One of those times is if the researcher can't tell the whole truth and needs to hold back some specific information that's critical to the research hypothesis. Maybe we don't want everyone to know that exactly what the research is. And again, I go, as a good example, you can think back, I go back to the Stanley Milgram. They didn't want people to know that they were actually wondering how far people would go if they were listening to an authoritarian figure. If you had said that to the participant before doing so, it would definitely alter what was happening. So that was very important to not let people know. Another reason why we may not offer informed consent for the research is when the researcher gives a cover story that's used to distract the participants from the true purpose of the study, which is, again, I guess that also could be considered in the Stanley Milgram, because that wasn't really partial. That wasn't part of the truth. So in order to get IRB approval for either of these, there needs to be written in the proposal that distress or harm to the participants is minimal or not at all, and that the actions and the activities are permitted by law or federal or institutional regulations. So these are the reasons why we would not be able to get the informed consent for the research at the initial onset of the research. One other thing we want to consider is when we offer inducements for research participation. These are incentives that can include money or gift cards or everyone can enter into a prize drawing, extra credit points, things like this. It's very important that when you do have an incentive, that it is not an incentive that is so large that it would alter the type of people that would be willing to do the research. For example, if I were conducting interviews, I might offer $5 gift cards to Starbucks, which is a legitimate and normal, I think, it's a legitimate, and it's not going to make someone second guess whether or not they would do research. It might just help kind of get them to commit to it. It won't make someone be too intimidated to cancel if they wanted, or to stop if they wanted. If I were, however, to offer a $1,000 gift card to somewhere, that might draw a sample population that would not normally be willing to do this, but really needs the money. And it might allow people that don't necessarily need the money to think, well, that's odd. What exactly are they doing? And it might keep them from wanting to be a part of the study. So on the one hand, a $5 gift card to Starbucks might get both low income and high income people because, it's a Starbucks. Whereas the $1,000 incentive might skew the sample population to where you're getting a population that really isn't representative of the population you were originally trying to get. And that would be a really, really expensive experiment. So you don't want to offer anything too excessive. You also don't want to do something where they feel coerced or stuck. One great thing that I've noticed that's worked a lot is when you say, feel free to leave your email address or check this or something if you want to participate in a drawing for a $50 gift card. And that is something that tends to work really well. Deception in research, I think I've touched on this a few times. But this is what's going to happen when the participants are deliberately misled about the purpose of the nature of the study. It can be active, so they can be deliberately lied to, or passive, where we just leave something out of the study. And in order to get IRB to approve the use of deception, it needs to be necessary. It shouldn't just be for the fun of the researchers. That if we weren't being deceptive, we wouldn't be able to do the same study. There should be no reasonable expectation for causing physical pain or severe emotional distress. We don't want to deceive someone and then break their legs. That seems not at all ethical. Participants need to be informed of the deception as early as possible, but not later than the end of the data collection. So by the time you have collected your data from the participant, they need to be made aware that this has happened. And sometimes that might be a group of participants. Debriefing is when we discuss with the participant the true experiment that was being done, and we let the participants know what the study was actually about. It's typically given at the end of a study, and oftentimes the debriefing might include answering the participant questions and addressing any of their concerns or misconceptions. It's done in order to reduce risk or harm to the participants. And ideally, another thing that the researchers need to do is they need to protect the participants if they determine that the research has caused any sort of harm to the participant. A confederate, as I discussed earlier, that's a co-researcher or an actor who pretends to be a participant in the research study for the purpose of scientific investigation. Sometimes these are the people that maybe also are known as a gatekeeper, that allow you to get in and do research, maybe in a group that would be normally not open to a public person doing research. There might be someone that kind of introduces you to the group and knows what's going on and sort of helps facilitate the research without other people knowing. So let's talk about a few other things that we want to consider when we're thinking about ethical considerations. One is understanding the difference between anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity is when we are going to protect an individual's identity. The identity of the participant is unknown throughout the entire study, even to those involved in the study, even to the researcher. Confidentiality is when people in the study that are maybe running the study or the researcher are going to know who the person is, but they are going to keep that confidential, and they will make sure that that information doesn't get out. One topic that a lot of people don't like to discuss is animal subject research. There are behavioral researchers that study animals. There are also some animal studies that are used in toxicology or some other hard sciences. Some of the advantages to using animals is that the entire life of the animal can be controlled from birth to death. Researchers can breed animals to control genetic differences, and researchers can control the animal's living environment. And those are some really, really big advantages. There are protections for the use of animals in research that actually have been in place longer than the protections we've had for humans. So there has been a long list of things that we do to protect the animals when they are being studied. One of the greatest studies that I've ever heard of is one of my toxicology professors, when I was a student, was telling me about they wanted to know about animals and whether or not they became amorous when they were drinking alcohol. So they had a group of pigs that they gave a lot of alcohol to, and apparently they weren't able to determine if the pigs were becoming amorous because they were too busy getting sick. So they learned the hard way not to give alcohol to pigs. And I just thought that was kind of a cute study, and the pigs were not harmed. In order to protect the animals in research, the research needs to be reviewed and approved by an institutional animal care and use committee, or an IACUC. An IACUC is very similar to a review board, but instead of having typical reviewers, you've got to have at least one veterinarian and one scientist that has experience with animals, including a member from the community. Again, they're going to review the protocol that you're proposing, and they will determine whether or not the protocol is good and determine whether or not they will approve the researcher. The researchers are not allowed to conduct their study without approval, and then of course once they are approved they need to follow the approved study, or if they need to make changes they need to go back to the IACUC to discuss or amend some of the protocols that were approved. There are many things that are in place to ensure humane care and use of animals in research. The APA Code of Conduct includes a list of researcher responsibilities to protect the care and use of animals. Researchers who use animals in research must do all of the following, or do the following. They need to comply with federal, state, and local laws in the care and use of animals. They need to use experienced professionals to supervise animals, train all individuals who will handle the animals, make a reasonable effort to minimize discomfort, infection, illness, and pain in animals, use justified procedures, including surgical, that minimize pain, use appropriate anesthesia in a timely manner to minimize pain. Researchers are responsible for welfare in animal subjects for the full duration of the time that they are under the researcher's care. And again, I took several classes in the toxicology department at the med school when I was a student, and I learned quite a bit about animal research. There were many professors that were very esteemed that had worked with animals in the toxicology department. That's a more common than in some of our behavioral sciences. And they went to great lengths to give the animals, again, the least amount of harm. And I heard of several studies where the animals were named and there were already families waiting after the duration of the study. It was heartwarming to know how often the animals were treated okay and were maybe observed for something and then had a really nice life. So most of my knowledge on animal experiments prior to that had come from Elle Woods in Legally Blonde. So I was very happy when I heard a lot of stories that the ending was quite a bit happier than what I had imagined. Just thought I would share that little tidbit with you. An additional ethical consideration would be scientific integrity. As a researcher or scientist, the two things that matter most and the two ways that they're measured is by their integrity and their accuracy. So what is integrity? Well, scientific integrity is the extent to which a researcher is honest and truthful in his or her actions, values, methods, measures, and dissemination of research. Reporting research results. For this, you need to have truthful reporting of the data and never fabricating research or results by making up data that were never observed or measured. Fabrication is a really nice big word for lie. And if you're going to lie about your data, you are now, unfortunately, damaging both your integrity and your accuracy, which are, like I said, the two things that matter. That would be just a gross misrepresentation of what you should be doing. If, though, however, you've made a mistake and there might be something inaccurate in your reporting, you can go back and retract what was said earlier, you can fix it, and you need to do so as soon as possible. Plagiarism is another way that our integrity can be challenged. Plagiarism is when we are taking information or ideas from someone else's work and we're representing it as though it were our own. As a researcher, we need to be sure to always acknowledge any work, ideas, theories that we're using to get us to where we're doing our research. Research is an iterative process. We definitely use other people's works and ideas, but we need to always give them credit, and we need to do so properly. And when it comes to publications, this is why there's very strict rules with citation, and we always want to cite someone if we're using their study or their information. One of the best ways that you can avoid publication problems is if you are citing someone and they are citing someone, which would be a secondary source to you, you need to always go back and find the original source, and that will help with having any unexpected problems with citing someone or acknowledging someone. So some of the biggest errors in reporting are, we have two big ones, errors in reported data, and this can either be intended or unintended, and plagiarism, which we just discussed. Again, plagiarism can be intended or unintended. How do we avoid the plagiarism? That's right, I just said it. You want to always go to the original source. You want to summarize it in your own words, and you want to be sure and credit the original source. There's also a problem with what's called duplicating publication of data. It is not appropriate to take the same work and publish it twice without recognizing that it's already been published. If I am working on a data set and I come up with this great idea, well, let me give you an example. Let's say like I've collected a bunch of data on what people did last weekend socially. And I have a question, whether or not people spent more time with a lot of people or more time with few people. And just kind of curious as to the number of people that participants are socializing with. If I had collected the data already, I analyze it, I write it up, I have that published, it is not a problem if I use the same data set for a different research question. I could then determine, I could test and analyze whether or not people did more socializing on Friday night versus Saturday night. So that would be okay. But I could not write another paper on whether or not people hung out with large groups of people or small groups of people and submit it to a different journal. That would be duplicating the data, which would be not good. The other thing that we want to consider when we're talking about scientific integrity is we always want to be prepared for sharing our data. This is a good thing when someone asks to see or use your data. This shows that our data is in good standing and that others are able to mimic or redo the analysis for replication and ideally and hopefully get the same results. That will strengthen our research. One way that we deal with the scientific integrity is to always have reviewers, and you've heard about having all the reviewers as far as like the institutional review board, but there's also reviewers that we have for the peer review process with our papers. After you've completed your research and you've written it up, you want to submit it to a journal, and a journal will then give it to a team of people, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 or 5, and they will review the paper. They will ask questions, ask for clarification, make observations, make notes and edits in the paper that could be just as far as grammar or about the actual methodology behind the experiment or about the field itself. And this information and these edits and critiques will go back to the researcher to make any necessary adjustments to strengthen the paper. It's a great process, it's rigorous, and it helps give science it helps improve on the accuracy and the integrity. This is one reason why what we see currently, we're hearing a lot of problems with science and trusting science and misinformation. And it always astounds me because I think a lot of people don't understand that scientists actually spend several years, 8, 10, 20, working on something. And it is a very rigorous process to have a scientist do an experiment or work in a field. So oftentimes I think the misinformation is not coming from science, but the people who are trying to very quickly and simply interpret the science. It's just something to think about as you're going forward throughout your life, to understand your source and who is describing your source. If it's the researcher, I think there might be a little bit more accuracy than if it might be a newscaster that's not understanding how to interpret the research. Just a thought. However, this we're going to wrap up about ethical considerations and research ethics. Keep in mind, we are constantly tightening and learning our ethical standards, and I think that's about it for this lecture. Have a great day. Bye-bye.